Chapter 1 The Quiet Routine of Joseph. Every morning, without fail, Joseph Hargrove would walk into the small, quaint coffee shop nestled on the corner of Oak Street. It was his little slice of peace in a chaotic world. Joseph, a man in his late 40s, had long ago become a figure who blended seamlessly into the coffee shop's daily rhythm. He was a man who didn't crave attention or fanfare, preferring the soothing routine of his mornings to anything else the day might offer. And so, each morning, like clockwork, he would enter the coffee shop at precisely the same time, greeted by the familiar face of Alexa, the friendly waitress who had become a part of his morning ritual. "Good morning, Mr. Hargrove. The usual today?" Alexa would ask with a warm smile, her voice light and genuine. Joseph, always taken aback by the simplicity of her cheerfulness, would offer a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, the usual, please. No need to fuss over it," he'd reply in a voice that had grown quieter over the years, filled with the weight of memories he didn't speak of. He always ordered the same thing, a black coffee and a croissant, simple, predictable. His life had become the same. His routine was sacred, a small slice of normality in a world that had long since been out of his control. Before he embarked on the long hours of meetings, case studies, and courtroom drama that defined his professional life, Joseph had these few precious minutes of solitude in the coffee shop. It wasn't much, but it was his. And that was enough. Joseph's life had once been so full of promise, full of love, and full of joy. But now, at 48, he felt as though he was carrying the weight of 1,000 regrets. He had built a successful career, had earned the respect of his peers, and accumulated wealth that most could only dream of. His legal mind was sharp, his reputation impeccable. People came to him with their most complex problems, and he had a reputation for solving them, swiftly, decisively, and often, with great success. But none of that mattered. Not anymore. The emptiness he felt every day was a constant companion. His mind wandered back to his son, Daniel. A boy who once filled his life with laughter and joy. A boy who had grown into a man far too quickly. Joseph's relationship with Daniel had been everything a father could want. But life had a way of tearing things apart. The separation from his ex-wife, the tension it created between him and Daniel, the lack of communication, one thing led to another, and before he knew it, his son was no longer the boy he once knew. Their bond had weakened over the years, and when Daniel decided to drop out of college and tour the country with his rock band, it was like a wall had gone up between them. The rebellious streak Daniel had developed was something Joseph couldn't quite understand. He felt like Daniel was deliberately pushing him away. It hurt, but Joseph had always prided himself on his patience. He gave Daniel space, hoping the distance would give him time to figure things out. But instead, it only deepened the chasm between them. Then came that fateful phone call. Joseph had been in his office, going over case files when his phone rang. It was from Daniel. A voice on the other end that Joseph hadn't heard in months, not since their last heated argument. Daniel sounded different, almost desperate. He mentioned something about wanting to talk. There was an urgency in his voice that Joseph couldn't ignore. They agreed to meet the following day. The next morning, Joseph received a message from Daniel, an emotional one. His son had attached a photo, a snapshot from a bus ride. In it, Daniel was smiling, his usual carefree expression shining through. But it wasn't just the photo of his son that struck Joseph. There was a woman in the picture, a woman with long, dark hair, and on her arm was a mark, a crescent moon-shaped birthmark. A mark that Joseph instantly recognized. It had been a part of his son's life for as long as he could remember. Joseph felt a sudden wave of hope. Daniel wanted to talk. Maybe this was his chance to make things right, to bridge the gap that had grown between them over the years. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild their relationship. He had been waiting for this moment, even if he hadn't realized it until then. He was ready. But as fate would have it, Joseph never got the chance to speak to his son again. The accident happened that very night. Daniel was gone, just like that. The message, the photo, and the hope that Joseph had carried for only a short while were shattered. The pain of losing his son was unbearable. The regret of not mending their relationship in time gnawed at him. He had been so close to having that conversation. So close. And now, it was too late. Back in the coffee shop, Joseph closed his eyes as the memories of his son overwhelmed him once again. The longing, the heartache, it was always there, lurking in the background. The coffee shop, the quiet hum of the morning, couldn't drown it out. "Your coffee, Mr. Hargrove," Alexa's voice broke through his thoughts, and he looked up, startled for a moment, as she set his usual order in front of him. "Thank you, Alexa," he muttered, giving her a small, absent smile. As she turned to leave, Joseph's eyes caught something unexpected, a mark on Alexa's arm. It was subtle, hidden beneath the sleeve of her uniform, but unmistakable. A crescent moon. His heart skipped a beat. That mark. He had seen it before. The photo of Daniel, the one he had received just before the accident. His son's last photo. Joseph's breath caught in his throat. Could it be? Alexa? He called softly, his voice trembling just slightly. She turned back toward him with a bright smile, completely unaware of the storm brewing in Joseph's heart. Is everything all right? She asked, concern flashing across her face. Joseph's mind raced. He couldn't stop staring at the mark. He couldn't let it go. He paused, unsure of how to ask. Do you know a man named Daniel? The question hung in the air, the weight of it heavy. Alexa blinked in surprise, her smile faltering for a moment. Daniel? She repeated softly. Yes, I did. Why? Joseph's pulse quickened. This couldn't be just a coincidence. He started, but his voice faltered. He was my son. Alexa's eyes widened, and for the first time, a look of recognition passed through her features. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. Tears welled up in her eyes, and Joseph's heart sank. I'm so sorry, Alexa said in a choked voice. I didn't know you were Daniel's father. In that moment, Joseph knew. This wasn't just an ordinary morning, and Alexa wasn't just a waitress serving him coffee. There was a deeper connection between them, one that neither of them could have predicted. The past, in all its pain and regret, had a way of catching up with you when you least expected it, and Joseph was about to learn just how far the reach of fate could stretch. Chapter 2, The Encounter with Alexa. Joseph sat back in his chair, the coffee now forgotten as he studied Alexa more intently. The mark on her arm, a crescent moon, haunted him. It was the same mark he had seen in the photograph that his son, Daniel, had sent him just before the accident. He could hardly believe it. How could it be? Could this be some sort of twisted coincidence, or was there something more at play here? The weight of the revelation hung heavily in the air between them. Alexa, still standing at his table, looked at him with wide eyes, unsure of what to say next. Her voice wavered when she spoke again, breaking the silence that had settled between them. I had no idea, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I had no idea you were Daniel's father. Joseph's mind swirled. He had never imagined that a simple morning routine, coming to his favorite coffee shop for his usual cup of coffee, would lead him to a moment like this. The woman who had served him coffee for weeks, who had become a part of his mundane routine, was somehow connected to his son. His heart ached, and yet, there was a strange sense of clarity in the air as if everything that had happened was pushing him toward this moment. Do you mind telling me how you knew Daniel? Joseph asked gently, his voice low and full of unspoken pain. He had to know. It was as if the question had been lingering on the tip of his tongue for weeks, waiting for the right moment to escape. Alexa looked down at her hands, taking a deep breath before she spoke, as though gathering the courage to reveal something deeply personal. She then pulled up a chair and sat down opposite him. The morning bustle around them seemed to fade into the background as the two of them found themselves in an unexpected, intimate conversation. We met when I was working at one of his band's gigs, Alexa began, her voice soft but steady. I was singing at the venue that night, just a local gig. His band was performing, and I got the chance to meet him after the show. He was different. He had this energy, this spark in his eyes, and we just clicked. I remember thinking, this is the kind of person you don't forget. Joseph listened intently, though his heart tightened as Alexa continued. He could hear the genuine affection in her voice, the tenderness that she had for his son, even though he was no longer there. We started seeing each other more often, Alexa continued. We toured together sometimes, and, eventually, we became inseparable. Daniel and I. We had this bond. We shared the same dream of making it big in the music world, and we always pushed each other to do better. He was a complicated person, but to me, he was perfect. Her voice faltered slightly as the words left her lips. Joseph nodded, the emotions in his chest welling up again. He could see it all in his mind, his son, a young man with ambition, with dreams that had seemed so unreachable but were within grasp. He had always been proud of Daniel's passion for music, but Joseph had never understood the depth of it, nor the way it had shaped his son's life. What happened? Joseph asked quietly, unable to mask the ache in his voice. I saw the photo he sent me before. His words trailed off as the memory of that photo, Daniel's last message, came rushing back. Alexa's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away for a moment, as if gathering herself. We were on the bus after one of our concerts. He had told me that he wanted to visit you, that he needed to talk to you. He was ready to make amends, you know? He said there were things he needed to tell you. To share with you. He wanted to make things right between you two. Alexa's voice cracked, and she wiped a tear from her cheek. Joseph swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. The pain of not being able to have that conversation with Daniel, of not being able to heal their broken bond, was too much to bear. But then, Alexa's voice broke off, and she took a shuddering breath before continuing. There was the accident. The bus rolled over that night, right after he sent that photo. It was a terrible crash, and Daniel didn't make it. She wiped another tear away, her face crumpling with the weight of the memory. I don't think he ever had the chance to tell you what he wanted to. And that breaks my heart, too. I wish I could have stopped it from happening. Joseph closed his eyes, as though trying to shut out the painful truth. His son, the one he had always hoped to reconnect with, had been taken from him just as things were beginning to heal. The promise of a new start, of fixing what had been broken, was gone. The guilt gnawed at him. Alexa, Joseph said after a long silence, his voice barely a whisper, what did Daniel want to tell me? Alexa looked up at him, her eyes filled with understanding. She knew how important it was for him to know. How much peace it might bring him, even after everything. She took a deep breath before replying. He wanted to tell you that he was going to be a father. Joseph blinked, his mind struggling to process the words. A father? Alexa nodded, her voice soft. Yes, Daniel and I were expecting a child. He was so excited about it, Joseph. He wanted to tell you. He was ready to be a better son, a better man. But her words trailed off as the weight of the moment seemed to sink in. Joseph sat back in his chair, stunned. His heart raced. He had always wanted to hear that his son was happy, that he had found purpose and joy. But to know that Daniel was going to be a father, to know that his son had wanted to make peace before it was too late, it was almost more than he could bear. Is it a boy or a girl? Joseph asked, his voice barely audible. Alexa's lips trembled as she answered, it's a girl. Joseph sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of the situation settling in. He had lost Daniel, but now, he was learning that a part of his son was still alive. A granddaughter. He had a granddaughter. As the realization began to sink in, Joseph's mind was overwhelmed with a mix of emotions, grief, love, regret, and hope. His son's memory had not faded away entirely. A piece of him lived on, and perhaps, just perhaps, this little girl was the answer to the aching emptiness Joseph had carried with him for so long. Alexa stood up, ready to end the conversation, but she hesitated. Joseph, I know this is a lot to take in. I just thought you should know. He was so proud of you. Even though things were complicated, he always spoke about you with love. Joseph nodded slowly, his eyes misting over. Thank you, Alexa, for telling me. I don't know how to say this, but I'm glad I met you. As she left him there, Joseph sat in the quiet of the coffee shop, a wave of emotions washing over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to peace. Chapter 3, The Connection to the Past. The days following that fateful conversation with Alexa were a blur for Joseph. His mind, which had been consumed with grief for so long, now struggled to absorb the startling news he had learned. A granddaughter. His son, Daniel, had been preparing to become a father when tragedy struck. Joseph had spent years lamenting the loss of his relationship with his son, regretting the missed opportunities to mend their bond, only to find that fate had delivered him a piece of Daniel, a granddaughter. The coffee shop, once a place of routine and quiet reflection, had become a venue for intense contemplation. Every time Joseph entered, his gaze would inevitably fall on Alexa, and he would see the reminder of Daniel, in both the woman who had loved him and the child she carried. Each encounter with Alexa seemed to reinforce the feeling that life, in its unpredictable way, had given him another chance, albeit a bittersweet one. Joseph's thoughts often wandered to that last photo Daniel had sent him, the image of his son on the bus, smiling with a woman beside him, her arm bearing the crescent moon mark that matched Alexa's. That image, which had once filled him with hope for a reconciliation, now left him with more questions than answers. What had Daniel wanted to say? What had been so important that he had tried to reach out, only for the accident to rob them of that chance? One morning, as Joseph entered the coffee shop, Alexa wasn't there. A fleeting moment of panic crossed his mind, but then he remembered she had mentioned something about taking a few days off. Instead, the barista, a young man with a scruffy beard, greeted him with a nod and a smile. Joseph ordered his usual, but he couldn't shake the thought of the conversation he had had with Alexa days before. Sitting by the window, sipping his coffee absent-mindedly, Joseph's thoughts were once again filled with images of Daniel, the boy he had raised, the young man he had hoped to reconnect with, and the man who had been lost too soon. He had been so focused on his regrets, so wrapped up in the pain of losing his son, that he hadn't even considered what Daniel might have wanted to say. That question gnawed at him constantly. What was it that Daniel had been trying to share with him? The answer seemed just out of reach, like a puzzle with a piece missing. Joseph's lawyerly mind, so accustomed to finding solutions to complex problems, felt helpless in this case. There was no logical explanation for why Daniel hadn't been able to speak to him one last time. There was no formula that could undo the years of distance between father and son. But there was Alexa, who had known Daniel in ways Joseph hadn't. Perhaps, in some way, she held the key to the closure he desperately needed. It was a rainy afternoon when Alexa finally returned to work. Joseph had been waiting for this moment, but now that it had come, he wasn't sure how to approach her. What could he possibly ask her that would provide the answers he was seeking? His heart still ached with the loss of Daniel, but now there was a new, inexplicable hope that he might find some piece of closure, some understanding, that would allow him to move forward. As Alexa entered the coffee shop, Joseph stood up, his heart racing. He hadn't realized how much he had been waiting for her return until he saw her standing there, the familiar smile on her face. The crescent moon mark on her arm seemed more significant now than ever, a silent connection between her, Daniel, and the pieces of Joseph's past that were still left unresolved. "Mr. Hargrove," Alexa greeted him, her voice warm and gentle. "It's good to see you again. Would you like your usual?" Joseph hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, please. But if you don't mind, could we talk for a minute? I know you must be busy, but there's something I need to ask." Alexa's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "Of course. I'll bring your coffee over in just a second." As she walked away to fill his order, Joseph sat back down at his table. He felt his pulse quicken. This conversation was important, perhaps the most important conversation he had ever had. He needed answers, or at least some sense of understanding. When Alexa returned with his coffee, she sat down across from him without hesitation, sensing the seriousness of the moment. "What's on your mind, Mr. Hargrove?" she asked, her voice still soft but now tinged with concern. Joseph paused, his mind struggling to find the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me the other day. About Daniel, and about what he wanted to say. There's something I can't get out of my mind, something that I need to understand." Alexa nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "What is it, Mr. Hargrove? I'll do my best to help." Joseph took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "You mentioned that Daniel wanted to make peace with me, that he wanted to tell me something important. I can't help but wonder. Was there more to it? Was there something he needed to tell me about himself? About his life? I've been thinking about that photo he sent me, the one with you in it. And I can't stop wondering if I missed something." Alexa's expression softened, and she reached for his hand, her touch light but comforting. "Daniel was always a little secretive, even with me," she said gently. "But I think he was finally ready to share something with you. I know it must be hard to hear this, but he wanted to tell you that he was going to be a father. That he was finally taking responsibility for his future, for his life. And he wanted you to know that, no matter how complicated things had been between you two, he loved you. He wanted to make sure you knew that, above all else." Joseph's eyes welled with tears, and he blinked them away quickly. The words were both a balm and a wound. It was bittersweet, hearing that his son had been ready to reconnect, to heal the wounds they had both suffered. "Why didn't he tell me?" Joseph whispered, more to himself than to Alexa. "Why didn't he call me sooner?" Alexa's eyes darkened with the weight of the loss. "He tried. He really did. But sometimes, fate doesn't give us the time we think we deserve. And now, we're left with the pieces of the past. The things we couldn't change." Joseph nodded slowly. "I should have been there for him. I should have made the effort sooner." Alexa squeezed his hand. "Joseph, you can't change the past. But you can honor his memory. And you can be there for the people who remain." Joseph swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat. He had been so consumed by regret that he hadn't allowed himself to see the possibility of a future that now included a granddaughter, and the chance to create new memories. Perhaps this was his second chance to be the father he had always wanted to be. "I never got to tell him how proud I was of him," Joseph said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "But I think he knew. Somewhere deep down, I think he knew." Alexa smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "I think he did, Joseph. He knew." Chapter 4, Revelations and Unanswered Questions. The days following the conversation with Alexa were both a revelation and a torment for Joseph. He now knew that Daniel had wanted to make peace, that he had been ready to share a piece of his heart and a glimpse into the life he was building. But the tragedy of it all weighed heavily on Joseph. The opportunity for reconciliation had slipped away, and it left him grappling with not just the loss of his son, but also the unspoken words and untold stories that would never reach him. In the quiet of his office, Joseph tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting. The questions wouldn't leave him alone. What was it that Daniel had wanted to say? Was there more that he was planning to share? Was the idea of becoming a father the only thing that had brought him back to Joseph, or was there something deeper, something more profound that Daniel had kept hidden all these years? Joseph knew that this uncertainty, this not knowing, would continue to eat at him unless he found some kind of closure. He had already made up his mind, he needed to learn more. If there was a chance, even a small one, to uncover something that Daniel had left behind, he had to pursue it. It wasn't long before he found himself back at the coffee shop. Every morning now felt heavy, laden with the weight of his past and the ghosts of things left unsaid. As he stepped through the door, the familiar bell above it jingled, signaling his arrival. His usual seat by the window was taken by a group of young professionals, so he chose a table in the back. There was no sign of Alexa yet, but he could feel the familiar presence of the place, the comforting hum of soft conversations, the clink of coffee cups. This place had become more than just a spot for his morning coffee, it had become a bridge to the past he was now trying to piece together. It was almost half an hour before Alexa appeared, and when she did, Joseph's eyes immediately locked on her. She was carrying a tray with several orders, but when her gaze met his, she gave him a soft smile that, for some reason, made him feel both comforted and uneasy. The unspoken bond between them, forged in shared grief, was still there, palpable. She set the tray down with a polite nod and then made her way over to him. Her smile, though still warm, seemed tinged with something else, perhaps sadness, perhaps understanding. Joseph wasn't sure. "Mr. Hargrove," Alexa greeted, her voice gentle. "It's good to see you again." Joseph smiled faintly, acknowledging her presence with a nod. "Good to see you too, Alexa. I was hoping we could talk again, if you have the time." Alexa hesitated for a moment, then nodded, sitting down across from him. "Of course. What's on your mind?" He looked at her for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He wasn't sure how to phrase the question, but he knew it had to be asked. "I've been thinking about the photo Daniel sent me, the one he sent right before the accident. There's something in it. Something I can't shake. There was a woman in the photo with him, and she had a birthmark on her arm. It's the same mark as yours, Alexa." Alexa's face tightened, a flicker of something crossing her expression before it was quickly masked by a gentle smile. She seemed to gather her thoughts before responding. "Yes. I remember. That photo. Daniel was happy when he sent it. He had been talking about coming to see you, about making things right between you two." Joseph's heart ached. The simple image of his son, smiling so innocently, filled him with a yearning for the relationship they could have had. He had to know more, he had to understand what had been so important that Daniel hadn't been able to share it before it was too late. Why did he want to make things right? Joseph asked quietly. His voice, usually so composed, was breaking at the edges with the weight of his emotions. "What did he want to say to me, Alexa? What was so urgent? Why now?" For a moment, Alexa said nothing. Her eyes flickered to the coffee cup in front of Joseph, and she seemed to be lost in thought. Then, she looked up, her eyes full of empathy and understanding. I think Daniel was trying to tell you that he was ready to be a different person. Not just for you, but for himself too. He wanted to show you that he had changed. That he wasn't just the rebellious kid who left home to follow his dreams. He had grown up, Joseph, he had responsibilities now, he was going to be a father, he was going to be someone you could be proud of. Alexa paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "And I think he wanted to share that with you. He wanted you to know that despite everything that had happened, he loved you. And he wanted you to know that he was ready to heal the wounds of the past." Joseph's heart was pounding. He had suspected as much, he had felt it deep down in his soul, even before Alexa had confirmed it. Daniel had been reaching out, trying to bridge the gap that had kept them apart. And now, he would never know if they could have found a way back to each other. "Did he ever tell you what he was going to say to me?" Joseph asked, his voice low and filled with desperation. Alexa shook her head. "No. He didn't say much. But I know he had been planning to visit you, to talk to you face to face. He had written down a list of things he wanted to discuss, things he had been carrying for years. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to make sure you knew he was sorry for the way things had gone. He didn't want to leave things unresolved between you two. Joseph leaned back in his chair, his chest tightening as he processed everything Alexa had shared. It was as if the very air in the coffee shop had shifted, everything felt more real, more intense. He was so close to the answers he had been longing for, but in the same breath, he was reminded that it was all just out of reach. The ache in his chest deepened, and he felt a wave of guilt wash over him. All the time he had spent waiting, hoping for something that would never come. A conversation that would never happen. He had been too proud, too caught up in his own pain, to reach out to Daniel when he still had the chance. "Alexa," Joseph said, his voice barely a whisper, "I should have tried harder. I should have done more. He was my son, and I just let him slip away." Alexa's eyes softened, and she reached across the table, placing her hand gently on his. "Joseph, you can't change what happened. All you can do now is honor his memory. I think Daniel would want you to live without regret. He would want you to find peace." Joseph nodded, the weight of her words settling into his heart. He had to learn to let go of the past, to forgive himself for the things he could never undo. And maybe, just maybe, he could begin to move forward, even with the emptiness of Daniel's absence. "Thank you, Alexa," Joseph said quietly. "I needed to hear that." The conversation had come to a close, but the silence between them felt different now. There was understanding in it, a shared bond of grief and hope. Joseph wasn't sure what the future held for him, but he knew one thing for certain: he had to keep moving forward, for himself and for the memory of his son. "I'll be here for you, Joseph," Alexa said softly, standing up to leave. "And I'll always be here to help you understand Daniel's story." Joseph watched her walk away, the weight in his chest still there but a little lighter. The answers weren't all there, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was ready to begin healing. Chapter 5: A New Beginning. It had been a few weeks since Joseph's conversation with Alexa. Life, as it always did, continued to move forward. But Joseph no longer felt as though he were caught in the grip of the past, lost in the fog of what might have been. The weight of regret that had once consumed him was still present, but it no longer defined his every moment. He was beginning, slowly, to reclaim his life. The coffee shop had become more than just a place of routine, it had transformed into a place of healing. His morning visits, which once felt like a painful reminder of the life he had lost, were now moments of quiet reflection, with a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. Joseph had always been a man who relied on structure, on discipline, and that structure, along with the small gestures of kindness he received from Alexa, had given him a sense of balance he desperately needed. One particular morning, as Joseph walked into the coffee shop, the doorbell chimed softly, and he immediately noticed something different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a palpable energy that seemed to vibrate throughout the space. It wasn't the usual hum of conversation and clinking coffee cups. This felt lighter, brighter, as if something new was about to unfold. Joseph spotted Alexa across the room, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw her. She was holding a small bundle in her arms, a baby, wrapped in a soft, pale pink blanket. For a moment, Joseph felt as though time had slowed, his breath catching in his chest. The baby's small face peeked out from the blanket, and Joseph could immediately see the resemblance to Daniel. The round cheeks, the gentle curve of the nose, it was unmistakable. The child had Daniel's eyes. His granddaughter, he had known she was coming, of course, but seeing her in person, seeing the tangible proof that a part of Daniel still existed in the world, was overwhelming. The pain of losing his son was still sharp, but it was now tinged with something else, a sense of hope, of renewal. It was as though Daniel's spirit had been passed on to this little girl, and in her, Joseph could find something to hold on to, something to cherish. As Alexa approached him, she smiled softly. There was a quiet warmth in her eyes, a kind of understanding that spoke volumes without a single word being said. "Good morning, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice gentle. "I'd like you to meet someone." Joseph stood up, his heart racing. He had so many emotions running through him, and yet, there was a calmness in the moment that made everything seem right. Alexa handed him the baby with a tenderness that made Joseph's heart swell. "This is Lily," Alexa said, her voice full of pride. "Daniel's daughter. Your granddaughter." Joseph's hands shook slightly as he cradled the baby, the weight of her small body grounding him in a way nothing else could. He looked down at her, her tiny face so innocent, so full of potential, and for the first time in years, Joseph felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time: joy. "She's beautiful," Joseph whispered, his voice thick with emotion. His fingers traced the soft curve of her cheek, the warmth of her skin bringing a sense of peace to his soul. "She looks just like him." Alexa's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she nodded. She does. And I think she's going to be just as amazing as he was. Joseph stood there for a moment, holding Lily in his arms, feeling an overwhelming sense of connection not only to his granddaughter but to Daniel as well. It was as though Daniel's presence had never truly left, his legacy lived on in the child before him. As Joseph held Lily, the world outside seemed to fade away. The bustle of the coffee shop, the sounds of the street outside, it all disappeared. In this moment, there was only him and his granddaughter. The connection between them was immediate and deep, as though a part of Daniel was alive again in the small child he held. "Thank you," Joseph said softly, looking up at Alexa. "Thank you for bringing her here.
I don't know how to explain this, but this feels like a gift.
A chance to start over." Alexa smiled, the warmth in her eyes deepening. "You don't need to say anything, Joseph. I can see it. She's going to bring so much light into your life, just as Daniel would have wanted." Joseph nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. He wasn't sure how to express what he was feeling, but in that moment, he realized that he had been given another chance. This child, his granddaughter, had the power to heal wounds he had thought would never close. She was a reminder that life could go on, that love could continue to grow, even in the face of loss. I think I'm ready to live again," Joseph murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "For her. For Daniel. I'm ready to be the grandfather she deserves." Alexa's smile widened, and she nodded. "I know you will be, Joseph. I know you will." The morning passed in a blur of smiles and quiet laughter. Joseph sat at his usual table, holding Lily in his arms as Alexa brought him his coffee, just as she had always done. But now, there was something different in the air. There was hope in the space between them, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. Joseph knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be moments of sorrow, moments when the pain of losing Daniel would come rushing back. But now, he also had something to look forward to, something that had been born from the love he had once shared with his son. As he gazed down at his granddaughter, he made a silent promise to her. He would be the father that Daniel never had. He would be the grandfather she needed. And in doing so, he would honor his son's memory in the way that mattered most. Lily cooed softly in his arms, and Joseph smiled. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. In that moment, Joseph Hargrove knew that life, no matter how painful, could always offer a new beginning. And this, his granddaughter, was the first step toward healing.
If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us and motivates us to continue sharing heartwarming, inspiring stories almost every day.